Alright everybody, it's time for us to jump back into my Destiny 2 subclass tier list series. In the previous 3 videos, we tiered the Warlock's Dawnblade, Stormcaller, and Voidwalker. Now it's time to move on to the Titan. If you missed the previous parts, you can check them out via the link in the top right or the pinned comment. In those videos, we talked about the criterion I'm using for tiering and a bunch of other interesting stuff, so go check it out. If you're all caught up, then strap in. It's time for us to tier the Striker Titan. Let's get started. Just like with the Warlock, there are universal mechanics that every Titan subclass has access to. We're tiering the Striker today, so that means we have access to 2 barricades for our class ability, Towering Barricade and Rally Barricade, 3 lift types, Strafe Lift, High Lift, and Catapult Lift, and 3 grenades, the Pulse Grenade, Lightning Grenade, and Flashbang. With those universal mechanics in mind, we're going to start things off with the Striker's bottom branch, the Code of the Juggernaut. Your melee ability is Frontal Assault. On hit, it reloads your weapon and increases your weapon's stability and damage. Knockout is a melee passive. After critically wounding an enemy or breaking their shields, it increases your melee range and damage for a duration. Reversal is a passive ability that causes melee kills to trigger health regeneration, and Trample is a passive that affects your super. Destroying enemies with Fist of Havoc extends its duration. The Code of the Juggernaut has a beautiful set of abilities that define a close quarters melee-centric playstyle and rewards you for engaging in it. Unfortunately, when you're fighting in that range, you're taking more risks, and sometimes it's just not possible to charge into a firing squad of enemies to start punching. This brings to surface one of the biggest issues with the subclass branch and melee combat in Destiny overall. Players don't have enough tools to make this type of playstyle work correctly, and I'll explain what I mean. Destiny at its core feels and plays like a typical sci-fi first-person shooter. It's a lot like Halo in the sense that you can't run out into an open field and get into a fistfight with a group of brutes or Cabal and expect to survive. Destiny dips its toes into the idea of being an RPG, but it doesn't go all in, so players are often left with the sparks and embers of what could be. In the case of the Juggernaut, the subclass branch is the perfect template for an aggressive tanking class, but players don't have the means to spec themselves for defense in a meaningful way, so it doesn't work the way it should. There are mods available for your armor that increase your defense and resistances, but the value you gain from them is marginal at best. Now, I can understand the developers not wanting to give players access to tools that make them nearly unkillable, but the ability to brawl with enemies without fear of getting slapped into oblivion is necessary for the Juggernaut, and neither its base kit nor modding options allow that to happen. Unlike Devour, Reversal only provides health regeneration, which is interrupted when you take damage. You won't be surprised to hear this, but you get hit by a lot of stray bullets when you're fighting in melee combat, so your health regen is constantly getting interrupted. In the Nightfall Ordeal, it'll be nearly impossible to go on a punching spree. Then we have Knockout. It's cool in concept, but it's undertuned, and I'm surprised to say that for a Titan melee ability. While it's possible to create shenanigans with this passive melee ability if you have the right combination of buffs, on its own, it's not good enough. A knockout punch is not strong enough to one-shot minor enemies in high-level content, and that's a huge problem that compounds with what we talked about before regarding your inability to spec into defense properly. This is all making the Code of the Juggernaut a recipe for disaster, and it's going to get worse when we add Fist of Havoc into the mix. It's fun, but it genuinely feels like the Titan's version of Tickle Fingers on the Warlock Stormcaller, and that's bad. A lot of roaming supers in Destiny 2 need a serious adjustment to their damage, and sadly, Fist of Havoc is one of them. The only redeeming quality about the Code of the Juggernaut is Frontal Assault. The weapon damage buff it applies on hit has a fantastic 12-second duration, and it's possible to keep this going for a long time with the insurmountable Skullfort exotic. Its exotic perk causes melee ability kills to reset your melee ability. Although you won't typically score kills with Frontal Assault since the ability itself doesn't deal more damage than a standard punch, kills while Knockout is active count as a melee ability kill, which resets Frontal Assault. So, in the end, a really cool concept is almost completely ruined by Destiny 2's lack of defensive options and the branch's inability to survive in the area where it's supposed to thrive. It's with a heavy heart that I have to place the Code of the Juggernaut in C tier. It's not a horrible subclass branch, especially in concept. The concept is actually really good, but in the current iteration of Destiny 2, it doesn't work the way it should. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we have the Striker's top branch, the Code of the Earthshaker. Its melee ability is Seismic Strike. While sprinting, press your melee button to charge forward and damage a target and all nearby enemies. Magnitude is a grenade augment. You gain an additional grenade charge, and the duration of grenade effects is increased. Aftershock is a passive ability that causes damaging enemies with Seismic Strike to reduce the cooldown of your grenade. And finally, Terminal Velocity is a passive that enhances Fist of Havoc. Your heavy attack leaves a damaging area of effect at its point of impact, and those heavy attacks deal increased damage when you jump from higher elevations. The EARTHSHAKER feels like it was designed with Destiny 2's gameplay philosophies in mind. Instead of attempting to tank in long, drawn-out melee battles, it takes down large packs with a single hit. Seismic Strike is the perfect melee ability for the Titan. It combines high damage and a respectable utility into a unique, fun package. It also has potential to scale up in effectiveness. In other words, the more targets you hit, the more cooldown reduction you get for your grenades. To make things even better, if you've got the insurmountable Skull Fort equipped, you have a potential unlimited access to Seismic Strike, which means you'll also be throwing grenades around like Halloween candy. Speaking of grenades, the Striker has access to arguably the best grenades in the game, and they're made better by the Aftershock passive. Even better still, they've got offense and utility. The Pulse Grenade will get you through the easy stuff, but the Flashbang is an incredible tactical asset to use when you're in high difficulty content. The blind effect it applies to enemies renders them unable to attack or defend themselves for a hefty chunk of time because of the Magnitude passive. So even if they aren't killed by the blast, they've been set up for an easy cleanup either with your guns or Seismic Strike. Now you can't go around blinding bosses and champions, but even at the highest level, there are enough minors, majors, and mini-bosses that will be rendered completely useless when you throw a flashbang through the door that I'd say they're worth bringing. So, we've got a phenomenal melee and a versatile suite of grenades to pick from, but there's still the question of the super. The code of the EARTHSHAKER uses Fist of Havoc just like the Juggernaut, but it has a passive that bumps up the effectiveness of your heavy attack by a decent amount. The extra damage from Terminal Velocity isn't enough to make me think Fist of Havoc is god tier, but it makes it feel usable. Once you learn how to control the momentum of your slams, you'll be a force to be reckoned with against large groups, and you'll be able to dish out decent damage to single targets too. The biggest downside to this subclass branch and the Striker overall is that there's only one subclass specific exotic that's worth your time. The insurmountable Skull Fort is too good to not use when you play the Striker. But don't get me wrong, I don't think it's overpowered, it's just every other Striker exotic is the hottest garbage, and most of the non-subclass specific Titan exotics are either bad or require very specific builds and playstyles to work efficiently. Overall, there's not much to say about the EARTHSHAKER because it's not complex or extremely flexible, but I think you'll be surprised to hear that it's very strong. I'm gonna put it in A tier. The meta that's been defined in Destiny 2 by the masses is very strict, and you won't see many people suggesting this branch as being anywhere close to the top. Some might even argue that it's not viable, but I think it's a diamond in the rough. To get the most out of it at the high end, you'll be using some unorthodox tactics, opting for flashbangs and crowd control instead of raw damage. You won't be able to seismic slam your way through entire missions, but opportunities will present themselves, and when they do, you'll be hugely rewarded for your efforts with kills and cooldown reduction. And finally, while your super isn't the best, it's a good mix of area damage, single target damage, duration, and cool points. Last but certainly not least, we have the middle branch of the Striker, the Code of the Missile. Its melee ability is Ballistic Slam. After sprinting, you jump into the air and press your melee button to slam down to the ground and damage all enemies near your point of impact. Inertial Override is a passive ability that causes picking up ammo during a slide to reload your equipped weapon and increase your weapon damage for a short time. Impact Conversion is another passive that causes hitting enemies with Ballistic Slam to grant super energy and activate Inertial Override. Finally, instead of Fist of Havoc, your super is Thunder Crash. You hurl through the air like a missile and crash into enemies to inflict massive damage. You create a damaging area of effect field at your point of impact. The Code of the Missile is a subclass branch that I have no doubt everyone is rooting for. Similar to the Attunement of Control with Chaos Reach on the Warlock, this subclass branch has decent abilities and a phenomenal super, but in order to tier the missile, we have to see how good the super is and how bad the abilities are. Thunder Crash deals an incredible amount of burst damage, but it can be a bit risky to use. Instead of sending out a powerful projectile, you become the projectile. A large majority of enemies in the game will get instantly obliterated if you direct hit them with yourself. But the ones that don't, typically boss level enemies, will retaliate and send you back flying in the opposite direction with a stomp. That, coupled with the fact that you're often in a bad position if you're standing near where a boss is or was, gives Thunder Crash risk to go with its rewards. Thankfully, the damage is so high that the risk is worth taking most of the time. Ultimately, Thunder Crash doesn't have the same safety or godlike potential as Chaos Reach, which means giving the Code of the Missile a tier on our list will depend largely on how well balanced its abilities are. Ballistic Slam and Impact Conversion are great together. The high damage of the Slam, coupled with the super energy generation on hits, help you use Thunder Crash more often, while dishing out impressive AoE damage in the meantime. With that said, Ballistic Slam is a high-risk move too, with the reward not being as high as Thunder Crash. Flinging yourself across the map to bash a pack of enemies only to have one or two of them survive can be a death sentence in the Nightfall ordeal, albeit an incredibly stylish one. However, if you're reasonably careful about where you slam, you won't have too many issues. Unfortunately, things are going to start getting a little dicey when we talk about Inertia Override. This ability provides a weapon damage buff, which is something I'm always in favor of, but its duration is way too short at just 5 seconds. I'm sure the logic is you can also trigger Inertia Override by sliding over ammo bricks, which means it can have a high uptime. But be honest, how often do you see ammo bricks on the floor and can slide over them without putting yourself in harm's way? This is another situation where, if the game allowed me to beef up my character more, I'd be more able to take advantage of abilities as they're intended to greater effect. As far as I can tell, the developers probably imagined Inertia Override working something like this. You kill an enemy and they drop an ammo brick, you charge forward, you slide over the brick, you get your weapon damage buff, and you start killing everything. That sounds really cool, but in practice, you're gonna die pretty soon after you pick up the ammo brick, and at best you're gonna kill 1 or 2 targets before the damage buff wears off. It's just not worth it. Now, if I could significantly increase my defensive capabilities, then I would be more willing to do some crazy stuff like that, but in the current iteration of Destiny 2, that's not possible. So, when you look at the full picture of the Code of the Missile, it has a lot of risk-reward splattered everywhere, and the risks don't always pay out. Inertia Override is a crappy passive that's not worth going out of your way to trigger with the slide, but Impact Conversion and Ballistic Slam are a match made in heaven, and they're having a threesome with the insurmountable Skull Fort while Thunder Crash is filming. What? I'm saying things aren't perfect, but you can get away with using this subclass across any difficulty the game has to offer. The biggest struggle you'll run into is that the risk of using Ballistic Slam and Thunder Crash goes up as enemies start to deal more damage and survive more hits. With all of that said, knowing what we know about the subclass branches that have fallen into A tier already, the question is, does the missile belong there? It's a very unsafe subclass branch, so even though its damage is great, whenever I play it, I know there are ways for me to dish out similar or better damage without worrying about getting slapped to death by enemies. My heart is telling me that the Code of the Missile belongs in A tier, but my mind is convinced that it truly belongs in B. And there we go, that's going to do it for the tiering of the Striker Titan. So far so good. It's going to be interesting to see how the different subclasses for the Titan match up with the Warlock. Is it going to be overall better, or is the Titan going to fall short in some areas? The only way to find out is to keep watching as we fill things out. Before we close out completely, I want to give a special shout out to my patrons. You guys are really awesome for providing additional support to the channel. And there's going to be a lot more bonus content coming out once the Beyond Light expansion is released for Destiny 2, and I start doing more exotic reviews again. There's a lot of fun behind-the-scenes stuff that I like to talk about with regards to how I edit my videos and the creative process. There is currently a playlist with 24 bonus videos in it, and if you'd like to check that out, you can look in the description right now. With all of that said, if you're not a patron and you'd like to support the channel more than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting, you can head over to patreon.com/iBlueAirJGR to become a patron. As always, the name of the game is Destiny 2, the name of the channel is iBlueAirJGR. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.